Hi there, this is Max Nielsen-Pincus with ESM 335 at Portland State University, and I'm providing a video today to help prime the discussion and your interest in the case study this week, week 4, on learning from failure, watershed conservation on the Crooked River. So today's video is going to focus on the Oregon Plan and the development of a new set of institutions for watershed management in Oregon. The picture you see here is the reach of the lower Crooked River through the Prineville Valley that you'll read about in the case study. And I want you to think a little bit as we're going through today's video about this reach and the case that you're going to read this week, to think about the challenges to managing watersheds in the context that you see on the screen right now. We're going to back up though a little bit and begin with the Endangered Species Act and what I'll call the salmon crisis. So salmon populations around the time that Oregon became a state were massive. We saw millions of salmon returning every year into Oregon streams and rivers to spawn and then restart their life cycle. By the 1930s and 1940s and 50s, those populations had begun declining somewhat precipitously. And by the 1980s and 90s, we had relatively few salmon returning to various reaches of Oregon's rivers. And in 1991 and 92, NOAA Fisheries listed the Snake River sockeye and Chinook salmon under the Endangered Species Act, and began proposing listings for the Grand Ronde and Rogue basins as well. In 1993 through 1997, NOAA Fisheries began considering listing of coastal coho as an endangered species. Coastal coho ranges the entire range of the Oregon coast, and a listing would impact a major region all across Oregon instead of individual watersheds. And thus, out of this and the considerations and listings of salmon species across Oregon was born the Oregon Plan for Salmon and Watersheds. The Oregon Plan for Salmon and Watersheds became Oregon's strategy to manage watersheds. Its goals were to create community-based action through investing in local solutions and public-private partnerships, to coordinate agency programs, to coordinate implementation of existing laws, and to provide science-based management that monitors outcomes and adapts management practices to improve watersheds across the state. And it was meant to be a living strategy, one that could be revised and adapted to. But we're going to go back before the Oregon Plan for salmon and watersheds because it didn't start here. The interest in watershed restoration began much earlier than 1997 with the Oregon Plan for salmon and watersheds. So it didn't just happen. It didn't come out of nowhere. Instead, changes in management and policy as well often occur through incremental changes, often through trial and error, by trying adaptations, maybe going through formal adaptive management processes that foster social learning and then buy-in from people from various different stakeholder groups to create enduring change. So we begin with an evolving watershed management in Oregon. In the late 1980s, we began to see increasing drought, particularly in eastern Oregon, and conflict over threatened and endangered species, as well as others. In 1986, a legislative commission on water resource management was formed to look at these challenges and begin to make suggestions. Out of that legislative committee became a recommendation for what became Senate Bill 23 in 1987, which created the Governor's Watershed Enhancement Board. The Governor's Watershed Enhancement Board, or GWEB, was tasked with managing a set of demonstration projects and holding workshops. They were given a budget of approximately $1 million per biennium, and they were tasked with coordinating state natural resource agencies across bureaucratic and geographic boundaries, something that really hadn't happened before, where different agencies were much more siloed, both bureaucratically but also geographically with where they worked. Following the Governor's Watershed Enhancement Board and the demonstration projects and workshops that GWEB put on, in 1993, the Oregon Senate passed Senate Bill 81, which created something called the Oregon Watershed Health Program. The Watershed Health Program actually created a $10 million fund to create 2 pilot watershed councils to implement watershed restoration in their respective watersheds. Those watershed councils included in the Grand Ronde in northeast Oregon and the Rogue River in southwestern Oregon. 2 years later, around the time that Governor John Kitzhaber took office, the outcomes of the Oregon Watershed Health Program were begun to be quantified. And we saw examples of stream restoration occurring, riparian planting and fencing, fish screening, and fish passage occurring in streams. And perhaps more importantly, we saw participation of local stakeholders from diverse sets of interests in these projects. And out of that, the state legislature decided that these model watersheds that were created out of the Oregon Watershed Health Program were worth investing in further across the state. And the House, through House Bill 3441, created guidance on establishing watershed councils in 1995. Watershed councils, they determined, had to be comprised of local stakeholders, they had to be voluntary, and they had to represent a balance of interests in each watershed. So Governor Kitzhaber becomes governor, and he begins to see the outcomes of our past approaches, like the Oregon Watershed Health Program. And he sees the salmon crisis, the declining numbers of salmon returning to Oregon watersheds, and the potential for listing and conflict over natural resource management, in light of the division of Oregon's natural resource stakeholders and rural communities over past Endangered Species Act listings. So think of the case study from week 2 when you learned about the spotted owl and the divisions that it created across communities and across natural resource stakeholders. And so Governor Kitzhaber saw this as an opportunity for not repeating the same mistakes of the past. And instead wanted the potential for a listing of Oregon, found the potential for listing of Oregon coastal coho as one that could infect the entire coastal region and its economy, and wanted a solution, a local Oregon solution that would be more flexible and better suited to salmon recovery than the federal regulations of the Endangered Species Act. And in 1995, he made the statement that we must be willing to risk failure, but we cannot afford not to try. And he commits his resources of state government to bring the salmon back. And through that, the governor creates something that eventually got called the Oregon Coastal Salmon Recovery Initiative. It was focused on that coastal coho region. What he did was he brought together in biweekly meetings the Oregon Departments of Forestry, Water Resources, Fish and Wildlife, the Department of Agriculture, DEQ, to answer questions about what watersheds are and how they best function and how they can support coastal coho salmon. The outcome of those discussions was the development of the Oregon Coastal Salmon Recovery Initiative, a management plan designed to avoid listing of coastal coho. And the plan, the OCSRI, or Oregon Coastal Salmon Recovery Initiative, basically said that we're going to invest in local solutions, we're going to create public and private partnerships that are science-based and adaptive, that rely on existing law, and that take a whole watershed approach. The draft plan received both scientific and public review as OCSRI was rolled out and became public. And eventually, OCSRI was designed to become the Oregon Plan for Salmon and Watersheds. So it becomes this template for watershed conservation planning for the entire state, even though the OCSRI itself only focused on the coastal region. Feedback from the draft review of the Oregon Coastal Salmon Recovery Initiative was gathered from public interest groups, scientific societies, industry, and basically across the variety of groups that gave feedback. They identified the need to simultaneously address salmon recovery through issues like the Endangered Species Act, water quality through issues like the Clean Water Act, as well as watershed health as it was embodied in a variety of different Oregon state laws. And these revisions and the feedback that was provided was incorporated into the Oregon Coastal Salmon Recovery Initiative, expanded to cover the entire state, which became the Oregon Plan for Salmon and Watersheds, which was released in May of 1997. Very appropriately timed, several weeks later, after the release of the Oregon Plan for Salmon and Watersheds, NOAA Fisheries decided to list the Southern Oregon and Northern California subspecies of coastal coho under the Endangered Species Act. However, due to the presence of the Oregon Plan for Salmon and Watersheds, NOAA Fisheries decided not to list the Oregon population of coastal coho, which covered the remainder of the Oregon coast. Now Oregon had a plan, a piece of paper, a document that said how and what it was going to do to address salmon recovery. Of course, not everybody was happy with that as a rationale or a means to avoid listing of the Oregon coastal Oregon coastal coho population of salmon. And of course, NOAA Fisheries was sued shortly thereafter. That's another story. We're not going to go into that here. However, it is an interesting one. But nonetheless, we had a plan. We had an approach to managing watersheds across the state that was designed to improve salmon, water quality, as well as watershed health and function across the state. But that plan itself was just a piece of paper. So the question was, how were we going to implement the plan? How are we going to convert that plan into management? And the main question here is one of funding. Where's the money? Where's the resources to actually accomplish the goals that the Oregon Plan for Salmon and Watersheds sets out? So this funding obstacle was initially met by a one-time pledge in 1996 from both the legislature as well as timber mining and fishing interests, which pledged $15 million each on the industry side through voluntary taxes and licenses, and on the legislative side by appropriating funding to match the industry contribution. That $30 million in 1996 was used to fund stream programs, to fund grants to watershed councils, and to create 45 new agency technical assistance positions that would work in tandem with those watershed councils. But again, remember, this was a one-time pledge. And so what we're left with is what happens after the $30 million is gone. Now, to address that issue, Measure 66 was floated statewide as a ballot measure through a coalition of interests from conservation, business, and industry groups. The measure would dedicate 15% of state lottery funds, 7.5% to Parks and Recreation, and 7.5% to salmon recovery and watersheds in perpetuity, or at least for some long period of time. The Measure 66 also required the salmon and watershed funding, that 7.5%, to be administered by a single state agency rather than being parceled out into the various different silos of different agencies. So out of Measure 66, we get the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board. Measure 66 passed and created to administer those funds the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, which expanded the original GWEB, or the Governor's Watershed Enhancement Board, and added new positions for new voting positions, both tribal and public voting positions, as well as non-voting positions like technical assistance positions from the EPA and the National Marine Fisheries Service, or NOAA Fisheries. OWEB, or the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board's mission, was to help create and maintain healthy watersheds and natural habitats that support thriving communities and strong economies. So you really see this multi-legged stool approach here: healthy watersheds and natural habitats, as well as communities and economies, with a vision that all three of those things can go together. OWEB was initiated with administrative staff to run grant programs, to fund projects that would support the Oregon Plan, to support capacity of local watershed councils, to promote education and education about watersheds and restoration, to provide technical assistance about restoration, as well as to monitor the effectiveness of the Oregon Plan. And so thus we get a board, an Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, a state agency that is comprised of all of the state natural resource agencies, as you see on the video here, but also other interests from the federal government as well, from Oregon State Extension Service, the organization at Oregon State University that outreaches to landowners, tribes, and a public at-large position was added as well. So we really begin to see this coalescing of all the different natural resource agencies and interests in watershed management in this one entity, the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board. So a summary, so remember we said earlier, we talked about the incremental change that that often occurs in management in order to create enduring change. So a summary of that incremental change is that we began with drought in the 1980s, which eventually led to the formation of something called the Governor's Watershed Enhancement Board, or GWEB, which then led to the creation of the Oregon Watershed Health Program, which funded 2 model watershed councils to test the idea of watershed councils, which was then expanded to allow for the creation of watershed councils across the state, which was supported by the Oregon Coastal Salmon Recovery Initiative and eventually the Oregon Plan for Salmon and Watersheds, which then was funded by Measure 66 and the creation of OWEB. Now the story goes on from there, but we're going to hold off on telling the rest of that story from now, and you can read more about it in the case study. You can also learn more about it in future classes that you take at Portland State. So what's happened since? Well, I'm going to be brief here, and this is just a teaser of what's happened since. So since we had the Oregon Plan, we now have over 90 operating watershed councils across the state. Roughly 2/3 of those are funded directly through the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, both for capacity support, to have staff to keep the lights on and the doors open, but also to have project and technical support as well. In addition to that, we've spent over $1 billion over the last 20 plus years in state, private, and federal money and other money that have come together to support the goals of the Oregon Plan for Salmon and Watershed. So that's our teaser. That's the intro video for today. And as you go forth and read the case study for this week, I want you to consider a few things in the context of the picture that's on the right here. Remember, this is the Crooked River's Prineville Valley reach of the Lower Crooked. And as you look at that, you can see the very flat valley bottom with the Crooked River zigzagging and meandering across the valley bottom due to its low slope. It's a very alluvial valley bottom with real fine soils. And you'll notice just from looking at the picture, you don't see much of a riparian area, and there's intensively managed agriculture on either side of the Crooked River on the left, as well as the slough that's on the right. And so I want you to think about how Leopold's land ethic and Pinchot's wise use approach how Leopold's land ethic and Pinchot's wise use approach are to conservation are relevant in the case of the Crooked River. What do these two ideas mean in this context? And use that to then think about why the case of the Crooked River's Prineville Valley is so challenging and so complex and led to the challenges that you'll read about in the case study. And finally, I want you to think a little bit about what do you think Paul and the Crooked River Watershed Council should have done following those high flows in the winter of 2006 on the Lower Crooked River? How should have they recovered from that? So these are some of the discussion ideas that I want you to have in mind as you move forward towards that reading the case. And then finally, I've just provided a few more resources. Now this is a video, so you'll have to type these in, but you can always pause the screen to jot down the web addresses. You can learn more about the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board and the Oregon Plan for Salmon and Watersheds at the first website here. The Network of Oregon Watershed Councils is a private nonprofit organization that tries to bring together watershed councils and create community around them for learning about watershed restoration, but also learning about the process of engagement and bringing people together for watershed restoration. And then finally, I've included a few links, or a couple of links here to the Crooked River Watershed Council. The first will tell you about some of the Crooked River Watershed Council's projects. Now you can also look at many other watershed councils across the state, and you'll find similar types of information on their websites as well. But since the case is focused on the Crooked, we'll look at the Crooked Rivers. You can look at their projects. If you scroll midway down the page, you'll see something about the Lower Crooked River Strategic Restoration Initiative, and you can read that to find a little bit more about how they have addressed restoration in the Prineville Valley Reach since 2006. And then finally is a YouTube video produced by the Crooked River Watershed Council on one of the projects that they have more recently engaged in that will help bring salmon, both salmon and steelhead, back into that lower Crooked River Prineville Valley reach. And I want you to think a little bit about what that means, what that reach might look like, and what that might mean for salmon and steelhead that are returning today. So with that, I say thank you and have a good week.